From building the iconic cars that defined a nation, to being sold for the price of a pepperoni pizza, to 6,000 workers fired overnight, the Longbridge factory went from symbol of British pride to a national scandal. This is the story of how corporate looting destroyed a British icon and stole thousands of pensions. If you walk through Longbridge today, you're walking through a graveyard. Where 25,000 workers once filled these halls with life, now just 46 remain, ghosting through a site that has been erased from the map. Most factories die a slow death, but Longbridge was executed. Demolition teams leveled the place in 2006. They didn't wait around. Cab 1, Cab 2, the paint shop, landmarks of British industry were smashed into dust. The only things left are uneven patches of concrete and weeds that don't care about history. But to understand the scale of this industrial murder, you have to look at the victim. In the 1960s, the ground here actually trembled. The sheer weight of thousands of boots made the floor shake. This place was a civilization. It had its own gravity. The factory whistle marked shift ends and dictated lives alike. Fathers worked alongside daughters. Mortgages were paid and futures were secured behind these gates. Now that rhythm is dead, but this silence is suspicious, because the question isn't just why did it close? Factories close all the time. The question is, how did a company that owned the British market end up being sold for £10? To understand the heist, we first have to understand the treasure that was stolen. And that story doesn't begin with the bankruptcy. Let's jump straight into the early 1900s to a man who claimed he could see the future. In 1905, Herbert Austin stepped into an abandoned printing works on the edge of Birmingham. To anyone else, it was just a cold, empty shed with soot-stained windows. But Austin didn't see a derelict building. He saw the future engine of Britain. He took a gamble that would define the next century. On a 5-acre patch of land, he gathered 50 men, most of whom had never touched a car engine in their lives, and started building. It wasn't easy. Their first machine, the Austin 25-30, wasn't built on a line. It was crafted by hand, piece by agonizing piece. In those first 12 months, they barely managed to build a dozen cars. Austin himself would test the prototypes on the rough roads outside, returning every morning with mud-splattered boots and a list of things that had broken. This was the startup phase before the term existed. It was gritty, dangerous, and uncertain. But then, everything changed. By 1914, the world was at war. Suddenly, Longbridge wasn't just a workshop. It was a national necessity. Demand for munitions and vehicles soared. The government needed metal, and Herbert Austin delivered. The factory exploded in size. A machine shop, a forge, a workforce that swelled from 50 men to thousands. Capital flooded in, £250,000, transforming a small venture into a public juggernaut. But the real revolution wasn't the weapons. It was what came after the war. In the 1920s, Austin unveiled the Austin 7. The Austin 7 became the Model T of Britain, the machine that finally put the working class behind the wheel. Look at the photos from this era. Workers in flat caps and heavy aprons posing beside unfinished chassis in half-lit sheds. The pride in their faces is unmistakable. They weren't just punching a clock. They knew they were building something that had never existed before. A British automotive empire with ambition as wide as the country itself. By the end of the decade, the sound of a single engine turning over in a cold Birmingham morning had grown into a roar that could be heard across the world. Herbert Austin had built his empire, but as Longbridge entered the swinging 60s, the factory would discover that building an empire is hard, but keeping it alive is a completely different war. With 25,000 souls within its walls, by the 1960s, Longbridge operated less like a factory and more like a civilization. The site stretched across hundreds of acres, a skyline dominated by the massive towers of CAB1 and endless conveyor belts that snaked over the rooftops like arteries. Inside, it was a city within a city. 25,000 people, enough to fill a football stadium, clocked in every single day. The air didn't just smell of oil, it vibrated with the roar of presses and the latest pop hits blasting from radios. Shifts overlapped in a chaotic ballet. T-trolleys rattled down corridors, supervisors shouted over the din, and men and women worked side by side on the lines. For the people of Birmingham, that constant industrial roar sounded like a promise. A job here was the British dream made real. It meant a mortgage paid. It meant children educated. It meant 2 weeks of holiday at the seaside every summer. Sons joined fathers on the line. Mothers worked alongside daughters. If you worked at Longbridge, you belonged to something larger than yourself. You had social clubs, football teams, even annual dances. The factory's success was Birmingham's success, and business was booming. In 1965 alone, this single site pumped out 375,000 vehicles. That is more than 1,000 cars leaving the gates every single day. Leading the charge was the Mini, designed by the legendary Alec Isagonis, stylish, affordable, and unmistakably British. The Mini transcended engineering to become a cultural icon, driven by everyone from factory workers to the Beatles. The Austin 1,100 and 1,800 filled driveways across the country. At its peak, the plant ran around the clock, 3 shifts. The presses never went cold. Local pubs were packed, local shops thrived, and the money flowed. In those years, the idea that the gates might one day close was unthinkable. They were too big, too successful, too essential to fail. But history tells us that empires don't usually die from the outside. They die from the inside. And while the champagne was flowing in the boardrooms and the presses were thundering on the floor, a microscopic flaw was beginning to spread. And nobody was listening closely enough to hear it. On the surface, the lines were moving, the order books looked full, but underneath the shiny paintwork, the math was beginning to fail, and the culprit was the company's pride and joy, the K-Series engine. It was supposed to be a revolution, lightweight, all aluminum, a symbol of British technical progress. Instead, it became the company's executioner. The problem was a fatal design flaw. The head gasket was too thin to handle the heat. For the driver, this meant one day, usually around 80,000 miles, the engine would simply cook itself, steam pouring from the hood, the dreaded mayonnaise sludge under the oil cap. For the owner, it was a £2,500 repair bill, but for the company, it was a financial death sentence. Every warranty claim was a hole in the hull. Dealers were overwhelmed. The press, once eager to celebrate British engineering, started warning buyers to run the other way. Trust takes years to build, but you can lose it in a single afternoon on the side of the M4. But the engine was just a symptom of a bigger disease, obsolescence. While rivals like Volkswagen and Ford were investing billions in futuristic new platforms, Longbridge was broke. They were forced to play a game of automotive dress-up. The Rover 25, the Rover 45. These weren't new cars. They were aging Honda blueprints from the early 90s given a facelift and a new badge. They were zombies, dead technology walking. Engineers inside the plant knew they needed a new car to survive. They begged for investment, but the coffers were empty. BMW, who had briefly owned the company, took one look at the mounting losses and the technical rot and decided to cut the cord. They pulled out, leaving Longbridge with no money, a ruined reputation, and a lineup of cars that nobody wanted to buy. By May 2000, the company was bleeding cash. Reliability surveys ranked them near the bottom. The vultures were circling. The industry had written them off. The greatest factory in Britain was days away from closing its doors forever. But then, at the 11th hour, a savior appeared. A group of local businessmen walked in with a plan to save the factory, and they bought the entire empire for a price that sounded like a bad joke. In May 2000, the fate of 6,000 workers came down to a transaction that cost less than a round of drinks. BMW wanted out. They were hemorrhaging money, and they handed the keys to the Phoenix Four, a group of local businessmen led by John Towers. The price? £10. On paper, it looked like a fairy tale. The Phoenix Four walked through the gates as national heroes. They promised to safeguard jobs. They talked of a £1.7 billion revival. The workers cheered. The unions exhaled. The government offered cautious applause. But behind the smiles and the press conferences, the new owners were hiding a terrifying secret. They had bought the factory, but they hadn't bought the future. There were no new cars in the pipeline, and there was no money to build them. So they tried to pull off a magic trick. They took the aging, uncool Rover models, slapped on body kits, stiffened the suspension, and glued on the famous MG badge. It was automotive alchemy. The boring Rover 25 became the aggressive MG ZR. The middle-aged Rover 45 became the sporty MG ZS. For a moment, it actually worked. Enthusiasts loved them. Sales spiked. The £10 gamble looked like a stroke of genius, but you can't fool the market forever. Under the spoilers and the bright paint, these were still 15-year-old designs holding on for dear life. The company needed a real new car, codenamed the RDX60, to survive. But the RDX60 was a ghost. It never made it past the prototype stage because the capital simply wasn't there. By 2004, the magic had worn off. The K-series engines were still blowing gaskets. The new models were still old cars. And the cash reserves? They were evaporating. The Phoenix 4 grew desperate. They pinned their last hopes on a partnership with a Chinese giant, SAIC, hoping for an injection of cash to save the sinking ship. Negotiations dragged on for months. Rumors swirled. Inside the factory, the mood shifted from pride to anxiety. Production lines slowed. Suppliers stopped getting paid. And then in the spring of 2005, the Chinese negotiators took one last look at the books and walked away. The gamble had failed. The £10 were gone. And as the sun set on April 6th, the workers went home thinking it was just another Thursday. They didn't know that for thousands of them, they had just clocked out for the very last time. On the morning of April 7th, 2005, the sun rose over Birmingham, but for the first time in a century, Longbridge didn't wake up. There were no whistles, no thrum of machinery, just a locked gate and a piece of paper. Word didn't travel through official memos. It traveled through whispered rumors and frantic phone calls. By 8 a.m., thousands of workers, men and women who had given their entire adult lives to this place, were standing outside the turnstiles, staring at security guards who refused to let them in. MG Rover had entered administration. Inside the factory, the scene was ghostly. It was like the crew of a ship had simply vanished. Cars sat half-assembled on the tracks. Tools were left on the workbenches. The presses, which had thundered day and night for decades, were silent. The hum of production was replaced by the terrifying ring of office phones that nobody was there to answer. By noon, the news crews swarmed the gates. The shock was physical. You could see it on the faces of men who had started here as apprentices in the 1970s. One worker, his voice cracking, told a reporter, "I gave 30 years to this place. Now it's just over?" There was no severance package waiting, no explanation from the Phoenix 4, just redundancy notices and a command to go home. 6,000 livelihoods were extinguished before lunch. As night fell, the crowds lingered, unable to pull themselves away from the gates. They stood in silence, mourning not just a job, but an identity. The city that built the car was no longer building anything. But as these families went home to their kitchen tables to figure out how to pay the mortgage, they comforted themselves with one thought. At least we have our pensions. We put money away for decades. At least that is safe. They were wrong, because while the workers were standing outside the gates crying for their jobs, they had no idea that the money they had saved for their old age had already been raided. The real blow didn't come when the gates locked. It came weeks later, in the mail. Families gathered around kitchen tables, opening thin envelopes that confirmed their worst fears. The pension fund, the money 6,000 workers had counted on for their old age, had a black hole in it. Workers who expected to retire on £300 a week were told they would get a fraction of that. Mortgages bounced. Savings evaporated. In Northfield, unemployment spiked by 40%. Marriages cracked under the strain. "We kept our end of the bargain," one union rep said. They didn't. Because while the workers were navigating the poverty line, the Phoenix 4 were fine. Better than fine. They had ring-fenced £16 million for their own pensions. Untouched. Safe. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The question everyone asked was, where did all the money go? It took forensic investigators 5 years to untangle the mess. But when they did, they found a web of deceit. The directors had created a maze of 33 interlinked companies. They used these shell companies to move assets out of the car factory and into their own pockets. They sold the land for £74 million. They sold the engine rights. They sold the parts business. They even set up a tax scheme called Project Aircraft, involving leased Boeing jets to channel £10 million into offshore holding companies. In total, the Phoenix 4 extracted £42 million in pay and perks while the company was dying, and they knew exactly what they were doing. following, investigators found that directors had installed software called Evidence Eliminator on their computers the day after the collapse. Key files were wiped, decisions were undocumented. It was a systematic extraction of value, a corporate raid disguised as a rescue mission. In 2011, the directors were disqualified from serving on boards, but for the workers, that was a hollow victory. There were no criminal charges, the money was gone, and soon the factory was gone too. In July 2005, the bones of Longbridge were sold to Nanjing Automobile of China. It was the final indignity. Engineers arrived to dismantle the lines. The presses that built the Austin 7 and the Mini were crated up and shipped 5,000 miles away. But here is the final, twisting irony. Nanjing later merged with SAIC, the very same company that had walked away from the deal to save the factory just months earlier. In the end, the Chinese giant got the brand and the technology anyway, but without the baggage of the British workforce. The brand survived. The soul did not. And that leaves us with one final artifact. In the British Motor Museum at Gaydon, there sits a car. It is a Rover 75 CDTI, the very last vehicle to roll off the line. The paint is fresh, the odometer is barely touched, but it is more than just a hatchback. It is a tombstone. Every weld on that car represents a pair of hands that are no longer working. Every stitch of upholstery represents a skill that has been lost. Longbridge isn't just a story about bad engines or corporate greed, it is a warning. Britain once built more cars than Germany and France combined. Today, we're a service economy, buying back the brands we used to own. So as we look at the weeds growing through the concrete of Cab 1, we have to ask the uncomfortable question. When a country stops making things, it loses more than just jobs. It loses its future, and once it's gone, it never comes back.